So I'm so excited to be here. This is just awesome. We have a great team here in London. Just every time I turn around, it gets bigger and bigger. The customer stories that we've heard today have been phenomenal. And what I want to talk to you about is a little bit about why you're choosing New Relic in some cases. And you've heard a lot around how people use various pieces of data and functionality inside New Relic. And we actually wonder the same thing. We went out and said, oh, we have Trainline who's doing some awesome work on seeing their ticket sales and understanding what their business is doing in real time. And then we've got some other customer that's doing something that's really neat. And how can we help the customers who haven't sort of figured it out all on their own? And how can we go learn from our customers and help everybody else? And so that's what my team at New Relic does. That's their job, to go out and talk to you and your peers and help you do your jobs and help us figure out how to improve the New Relic experience. And so this gets down to this question of like, well, what should we measure and how are we going to do this? Lawyers. Okay, so you've seen this slide a couple of times, and application performance and customer experience and business outcomes, and you've heard a lot of people talk about it. And so we're going to dive into that a little bit more. And if you think about, okay, you have this crazy simplistic architecture, and you have a particular person who buys something or runs through a transaction, places a bet. You have another person who does the same thing but has a very different experience. And of course, averages suck, right? No customer is average. And so aggregating that data is not terribly useful because it doesn't tell us anything about who that customer was that had the bad experience, or who had the good experience, and how do we replicate more of that good experience. And so if you think about all of the touches that go through in every single little event, we want to capture all of that because we need to see that granularity of the different events across your entire infrastructure. And so Robson this morning talked a little bit about how all of that data is, in many cases, increasingly bigger than the databases that actually run your app. And this is incredibly important because there's a lot of data, and you have an application that's hard enough to run because your architectures are pretty big. And so what we want to do is help you analyze that data so that you can run your applications really well. And if you think about the way that we've done software analytics in the past, you had an infrastructure issue or an infrastructure monitoring team because generally the first thing that happens is you go, oh, it's the network or it's the server. And we used to have this proxy, like if the network was down or if the server was down, then the application was clearly a problem. But if the server was up, then the application was probably fine, and so who cared? But that wasn't enough, and so we started doing application monitoring. And application monitoring told us that the code was running fine, but it didn't tell us that we had somebody that was having a poor experience or a great experience. And of course, none of that matters unless we're actually contributing to the business. And so if you look at all of these silos, and I think John Lewis said it, I saw him here, so there you are. You have all these different tools, and they're different walls, and so you have these sort of random acts of analytics across your business. And so if you want to combine all of these, we want to connect those, and we're going to spend the rest of the time talking about that. You essentially have a big data problem, right? And so that solving for that problem from a technical perspective is actually pretty hard. And so, like, how do you do this? Well, from a philosophical standpoint, one of the reasons why you want to collect all the data is because you have this fundamental problem of, once I know something, I want to know something else. How many people have ever run a report for someone where they said, oh, show us all the transactions from last week? And so you go out and you do all the transactions from last week, and then you give it to them and they go, well, what about by gender? and you go, well, yeah, this is 3 trillion row database, and we'll just run another index across it. No, indexes are problematic because you never know what the next question you'll need to ask might be. And so then you say, okay, we now know what last week's data is, and we've rerun all the database and the indexes, and that's great. But what's happening right now? Right? We just made a change. Was it a good change or a bad change? So that importance of knowing what's happening right now. Do I hit send on the 4 million emails or not? Right? It's important that we know that, and knowing what happened last week is not terribly useful in some of those situations. It's very useful in other situations, but sometimes I need to know right now. And then lastly, the data has to be consumed not by just by a couple of experts in the corner, but by everybody. And so it has to be intuitive. And so from just a straight technology standpoint, how do you build that? Well, if you say, okay, I need really fast time to value, I need to have fast query speed, it's got to be super flexible, and it can't cost an arm and a leg. The way that, say, a Facebook or a Google or some of these other big web giants have solved for this, actually I'll get to that one in a second, the way that a lot of people have solved for it in the past is you basically do a very indexed environment with your analytics. And so generally it's a fairly big build unto yourself because you have to decide how much of the data you're going to collect. The query speed can be okay as long as you're querying on things that you've already indexed. Not terribly flexible because you have to know what questions you want answered before you build your indexes. And then it tends to be pretty expensive. And so if you've said, okay, well, the indexing is not good enough, I need something more powerful, than you do what the Googles and the Facebooks have done, which you build this huge, gigantic cluster. And it's not very efficient, but it's really big, and you now have access to all of your data. And of course, what we view is, okay, well, can we build something like this that's really big, but bring it to cloud scale, right? And that's what New Relic does. Because you have to collect all of those events to see the granularity, that's what we're all about. And so, the types of numbers, you saw Robson this morning with the quadrillion, that came out of the 176 trillion a day, so you multiply that out, you get to quadrillion. I'm in marketing, so yay for large numbers. But, you get a sense of the types of scale, and when you start spreading this across lots of people, then the economics get really good. So, okay, let's back up a little bit and go, we're all here to create great software, but what is great software? We've seen a bunch of it today. When I look out and I talk to many of you and your peers around, well, what are you actually trying to build? What works? There are 3 big things that come up in defining great software. So the first one is reducing friction. No big surprise here. Trainline's taking the friction out of buying a train ticket. John Lewis is taking the friction out of going to the store. Colossus Bets is taking friction out of knowing the last 3 digits in the number. Wow, that's awesome. Where do you go? That's just so cool. And so reducing friction is fairly common. But then the next step that's a little bit more unusual is these sort of moments of joy and discovery. So if you think about in the Trainline app, it will tell you where should you go stand on the platform. It's such a dumb little thing, but it's awesome, right? If you use Uber, you see the car coming. What a dumb thing, but who else watches that? Right? In New Relic, we want you to be playing with the data so that you can find these moments of wow, this is really cool. Look at all these people that are buying their train tickets at 6:30 and not 7, or whatever those things about your business are that you've never known before. Might not be crazy important, but all of a sudden, what are these? How can you discover more about your business? And then the last bit is that it's got to perform. Right? Because if you click on something and it doesn't happen, then I don't care how wonderful the other bits are, it has to perform. And then if you say, okay, well, how do you get to this? There's this mix of art and science where you say, hey, I bet that if we tell our customers where to stand on the trade platform, they'll use us more. And you've got this idea, right? So you say, okay, I've got this idea that it's going to do this, but does that translate to more money, right? Did it actually work? And so all of you are constantly running experiments, whether you think of them as experiments or not, on, hey, I've got an idea for a feature. Does it actually result in more money? So, and you look at like, and this always changes through the lifetime of a particular application. So early on in an application's life, Colossus Bet's fairly early, they're experimenting with a lot, right? If they want change in their environment and they want to measure the impact of those changes. As you get bigger and as a particular application or function in the application becomes a little more mature, you're like, no, we got this one. Like, let's not make a lot of changes to the point where when you get a very mature application, you start thinking about less about changes that you want to make to it versus changes that are foisted upon you. Right? So if you think about like Heartbleed or some other security patch where all of a sudden people had to change applications not because they wanted to, but because everybody had to. And so sometimes you want change, and sometimes the change just comes to you. But everybody deals with change on a daily basis. And so if you think about the change and you think about how you get this mix of art and science, the other problem that we have is we are selling to these carbon-based life forms, and the humans that interact with our software, contrary to popular opinion, have not evolved since 2007 when the iPhone shipped. Our human response times are sort of what they are. And there's some wonderful research that was done back in '93 around how humans respond to things. So when think about on your phone when you scroll through a newspaper article or something like that, how quickly does the app need to respond so that you feel like you're scrolling? Anyone want to guess? It's a tenth of a second, right? If my brain doesn't think, oh, it's sticking, if it responds in a tenth of a second. So then you go, okay, I've got that response. Now I'm clicking through a checkout experience on a retail store or some other checkout experience. How fast do I need to see a response so that I feel like I'm driving the experience and I'm not waiting for the computer? 1 second. And then if you want my attention, so how long am I willing to wait for something to happen before I will look up and do something else? Any guesses on that one? 10 seconds, which I think is actually fairly aggressive, right? So I will take 10 seconds if I really want that, place that bet, or if I really want that, to do that, I might wait 10 seconds before you've lost my attention. I might wait longer, but you've lost my full attention. So for any of us who know how this stuff actually works, that's a high bar, right? And people do all sorts of fun stuff. They put little curly cues that aren't connected to anything. That's like, no, pay attention. We've really got something going on in the back here. And we'll do all sorts of sort of human psychological hacks in order to keep people's attention. But this is a fairly high bar that we're dealing with. So what do great software teams do to deal with this? And there are three big things that we've seen in great software teams. The first is that they're organized for change. And I'll talk a little bit about that, but I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it. The third is that they tend to use cloud services, whether they build them internally or they use public cloud services. They tend to find abstraction layers that let them scale and move with speed. And then the middle one on culture and measurement, that's where I'm going to spend the rest of the time. But let's talk about change for a second. So there's an awesome study that the Puppet Labs folks did, where they basically asked, how often do you release code, and what is the ticker symbol of the company that you work for? And then they went and looked at all the ticker symbols, and they said, who has revenues that are growing and is profitable and has market caps that are doing well? And then, and oh, by the way, how many developers do you have? And what they found was that if your stock wasn't doing very well, you tended to sort of deploy less as you added the number of developers. If your stock was sort of doing okay, you were basically keeping up with the number of developers and the deploys. But then the high performers, the people whose stocks were actually doing really well, were deploying at incredible rates and had sort of broken through the mythical man month. Now, when I first saw this, I literally fell out of my chair. This is like, we kind of know this, but to be connected with your business, with the financial results of the company, 20 years ago, this would have been laughable, right? But today, the success of a company is almost always, or at least increasingly, connected to your ability to ship software. Amazing. Okay, so let's put that one aside for a minute and sort of, all sorts of talk about DevOps and that sort of thing. Let's talk a little about the evolution of cloud and SaaS. So when we first started using cloud and SaaS tools, for startups, it was because I needed to go fast. And for large companies, it was because it was this neat thing and we would go experiment with it. And then as a couple of the startups started to scale and do really well, one of the things that we noticed was that, and we as an industry, is that we all of a sudden could focus more on our business because we weren't spending our time having lunch with the Cisco rep and talking about whether we're going to use Cat5 cable or fiber or whatever the discussions were. We were focused on our business. And so what we have now are people who go to cloud services and seek them out, not because they think they're cool or they're trying for a time to market issue, but because they just don't want to manage those people to do all of that stuff. And then the next thing that's coming that's starting to get really interesting is that there are a whole bunch of services that are now available by cloud providers that you couldn't ever do yourself. So some of those are big data, they're mobile, there's the economics around some of these services are starting to get really interesting. All right, let's go back to data. So the problem that many of us deal with is how do we make decisions? So let's say we can change really well. Let's say we have all the cloud services. Now the question becomes, how do we make those decisions? Are we making them based on speculation or are we making them based on data? And so I have a personal experience where at a prior job, a manager of mine said, hey, we want to drive a data-driven project between sales and marketing, and I want you to lead it. You've got a sense around this data stuff, and so, and here's a book. Don't read this book. So the book's advice is basically go start a committee. And at the time, I was working at a $4.5 billion networking manufacturer, and the idea of yet another committee was just, you made me want to like give myself a paper cut and put lemon juice in it. And so just awful, right? And the way that we actually succeeded with that project wasn't by starting a committee. And the committees are important, and data standards and governance and all that kind of stuff is really important. But what made the project successful was that we showed a group of people a set of data that they'd never seen before. And my favorite story around this is actually New Relic's small business team, who has this acronym. And the acronym is you have to deploy the agent. And the reason why they have this acronym and the reason why there's this sort of little bit of frustration in there is because what's the behavior that occurs when the agent has been deployed? Well, we get on the phone with the customer and we're sort of talking them through a couple of the dashboards. and then it goes silent. And what's happening behind the mute sign is that they've gone, George, get in here. And George comes running in, and they point at the dashboard, and George goes, holy cow, I had no idea that that was a problem, and runs out to go fix it. Now notice what happened there. Nobody said, George, you write awful code. George, I don't like the way you smell. Like, there's none of that. It's just, hey, here's a problem, and we can all see it, we agree on it, there's no sort of back and forth, like we agree we've got a problem and there might be a couple different ways of solving for it, but like the bickering and the debate is gone. The other great story on DTFA is healthcare.gov. In the US, we tried to build a website so that we could give everybody healthcare, well, make them pay for it, but different story. And the myth is that when it didn't work, a couple people from Silicon Valley parachuted in and fixed it. The reality is what those people did is they came in, they deployed New Relic, and then they took the team that had built it in the first place and pointed at the dashboards and they said, what do you think? Right? And that's how you drive that cultural change, is by showing people data that they've never seen before. So, all right, I'm actually going to skip through this because big data problem, you've got to do this. So we want to create these feedback loops. Okay, this is the interesting bit. So we want to move from these random acts of analytics to a more holistic view. And the first question you should always ask yourself is, what game are you playing? If you are playing a e-commerce, your game might be daily revenue. Your game might be what's the volume of sales that you're doing? What is it that you're selling? What is it that you're trying to do? And so, if you think about e-commerce, Mark from Trainline this morning talked about he loves to see his daily revenue. Media, one of the things that people want to see is, are people sharing the content? Because if we know people are sharing the content, then there's an ad impression impact on that. If we know that in a SaaS business, churn rate is really important, and so we want to keep a really close eye on that. If you don't know what game you're playing for the business that you work for, just stop. Go ask. It's really important because everything else drives back from that. The next thing that you should think about is, okay, how does the customer experience influence the score of the game? So maybe it's social shares, maybe it's conversion rates, maybe it's some sort of end user performance. So Colossus Budge was talking earlier about, like, if the page response is more than 3 seconds, then they know they lose people. And so this could be all sorts of things depending on what your business looks like. But how does the customer experience influence the score that you're keeping? Some examples of this. This is an e-commerce dashboard, and at 12 noon, they shipped the 4 million emails, right? There's a promotion that went out, and then lo and behold, oh no, there are a whole bunch of errors right after that marketing event. And so maybe we want to do something about that. And we can see that in the other side here, that the conversion rate that we've decided to measure, the people who have page loads times of more than 5 seconds, like their conversion rate is a little different than the people whose performance is less than 5 seconds. And so we want to start tracking some of these things, and we have a number of customers that are starting to do things like this. That's very, very powerful because you can start to make determinations of, oh, well, maybe we've starting to get diminishing returns, and so let's change the page colors or the design of it rather than the performance or vice versa. And so if you think about, like, what are your conversion rates look like? Where are your purchases coming from? I use, for example, our own insights tool to figure out, like, should we come to London? Was actually one of this before we even hired Nick. We discovered we had a ton of customers here, and they were good customers doing interesting things. And so, this is a query that people want to know. Same note, like, I want to understand what's happening inside these conversion rates. This is a good one. So, okay, we've got the customer experience, we've got the game that you're playing, but what happens if something really good happens? So, if somebody mentions your site, Justin Bieber says, hey, I'm placing bets on Colossus.com. Probably shouldn't have referenced him directly, but can your site scale to meet that demand? Do you have that ability to scale? And so, you want to think about, how do you look at your load balancing, for example? And so, if you think about, okay, here, this is my load balancer. That's not very good from a load balancer, right? Those should be much more even. But I also want to look at what's my front end performance versus my back end, and you want to start diving into all of these. So then you say, okay, well, all of that's fine, but is your site up or is it down? And so the next thing that we want to focus on is quality. And whoops, there's a slide missing there. All right, so if you think about from a quality standpoint, measuring your uptime or your app errors or the successful deploys that you have, that's a really big part of making sure that you're open for business. And so if you think about what are the SLAs, if you're a mobile app, thinking about crash rates and thinking about the error experience. So if you want to calculate your dashboard or your SLAs, our synthetics products are awesome for that. And so, you should know what this looks like, and you should be able to query on it and start comparing it to your daily dashboard. So so for revenue or other metrics that you're tracking. And then the last piece of this is how quickly can you build and deliver new functionality or fix and find problems if that's more your headspace. And so when you think about how lead time, how long does it take you to go from idea to delivery? How long does it take you to deploy? How long does it take you to find the problems? And so when you look at all of these different sort of metric types, what we found is that all of our best customers, and I think the train line this morning was a great example of all of them measure all of this. They don't necessarily measure it all with New Relic, but they all measure things that are in each of these boxes. And so what I would encourage you to do is to think about, okay, which of these are you measuring well today? What do you aspire to? And then most importantly, how do you find the connective tissue between these boxes? And I should also mention that we're still in early stages on this. We came up with this framework, and it seems to work pretty well. But if you're sitting there going, holy cow, they totally missed something, come find me afterwards. This is what many of our best customers have told us that they do, and we sort of synthesized it into this. But we want to help you figure these things out, and hopefully this is helpful. So, on that velocity side, this could mean any number of things. And one of my favorite examples of this is a global retailer who in late October basically ripped all the marketing stuff off their site for performance. And so they essentially said, hey, marketing team, during our busiest time of the year, you're going to go blind. And I can't tell you who this is, but and I had to check to make sure it wasn't on there. But this is, but the other piece is how long did it take them to do this, right? How long did it take them to pull everything out? All right, so a couple others that are just kind of interesting. This is one of my favorites. We have a bunch of people doing this. It's a very simple query, okay, if you're in the middle of the cart transaction and you experience an error, how much money was in your cart at the time? Because you lost that money, right? And so these are people who are trying to give you money, and it's gone now. So, in terms of hey, this is how much this error is costing us is helpful. Another good one, let's keep going. All right, so one of the things that we see people struggle with is trying to measure too many things. And as a matter of fact, Colossus Betts, one of his comments was, hey, I'm not measuring all this stuff, I'm just doing these simple things. That's awesome. Don't do too many things. Find a couple things that matter and start there. You can always add more. And then the other piece is there's lots of gaming the system, right? Oftentimes people will go, hey, I've got a metric that makes me look really good. And so the other piece there is that we don't necessarily want to publicize personal metrics. I don't want to say George did 8 deploys, and that was really awesome of George, because then what George will do is he'll just do a bunch of small deploys and game the system. And there's an awesome Dilbert where the pointy-haired manager says, like, I'm going to give you $5 for every bug that you fix. And the guys are like, oh, I'm going to go fix myself a new car. And so, there's a lot of ways to game the system. And so what we recommend is that you shouldn't measure the individuals, but measure the teams and the processes, because you're looking for those outcomes. And it's also easy to sort of become in love with a particular metric that you agree with something, and so if you say, hey, we all agree with this because it makes us look good, that might not be the metric to follow. And so you always want to challenge your biases and go explore the data a little bit more and make sure you understand the context of the data that you have, because the more objective that you can be, the stronger your decisions will be. And the last thing, and I talked a little bit about this, like measuring your server performance by itself is not terribly useful if you can't connect it to an experience metric, or if you can't connect it to a business outcome. And so the real trick here is finding the connective tissue between each of these metric types. And on top of that, that's also what drives collaboration across different silos of the company. So just to finish up here, start out with a small number of metrics. Make sure that you're measuring the teams and the processes. Give your data that purpose. Make sure you cross those silos. And then the last bit is, your metric, your business will change, and so the types of things that you're going to measure are not static. And so you want to be flexible enough to understand what's important at any particular point in time in your business. So thank you so much. I'm Abner G on Twitter. There's a great ebook that we published that actually has a lot of the measurement framework in there, so I'll tweet that out in a couple minutes. And I'll be around for questions for the rest of the day as well. Cool. Thank you.